Another example, I had an forensic accounting firm that I represent. The owner is the rainmaker. He generates 75% of the business. He's 65 years old. He wants to retire. So he enters into negotiations with the rest of his team to sell out his interest over time. He believes, and he's a very strong-minded individual, he's an expert, he testifies on valuation, for God's sake. He believes that the company's worth $8 million. So the smart young minority, potential minority owners in the meeting trying to negotiate how this is going to work say, that's great for you, but how are we going to pay for it? The minute you leave, we're going to lose half of our business. And then he turns to them and says, well, that's your problem. You need to get out there and develop more business. How many times have you heard that, right? And then the young ones say, you know what? I'm not signing on to this. I'll go work for another company that's bigger and they'll pay me more and I don't have to take that entrepreneurial risk. So it's a question of whether the young group or the next level is willing to take the entrepreneurial risk and how much that value is. It's what a willing buyer is willing to pay the willing seller. It's not what the appraiser necessarily says it is. And so if you lock yourself into an appraisal, you better be darn sure that the level of value and the standard of value and the appraiser's qualifications match up to your needs or your client's needs in this particular instance. And the funding mechanism, if there's not enough cash flow in the business and there's not enough liquidity outside the business to afford the buyout of whoever it is that's selling, then you better rethink the valuation. And that's why formulas do become important, because we know what the cash flow ability of the business is, and maybe we want to adjust it based on the cash flow, or cap it at a certain level so that the company doesn't have to buy out if it doesn't have enough cash flow.
But that's part of the problem. And I've encountered with free cash flow, let's just say. It's always this, we base it on cash flow. Well, I had a biotech company that was doing real good in Maryland until you know what happens. And all hell goes to the handbasket. And then what was a cash flow is no longer. It's a moving target.
Well, in a biotech company, you're absolutely right, particularly if they're in the stage of FDA approval, which may take 10 to 15 years, which is another problem in our economy that we could go off and have a nice discussion over cocktails on, but that's why people go to Europe to get their drugs, right? With biotech, it's really unique. Unless you have a really large sponsor for the small biotech company, or you have a market exit for that particular drug or system that they're developing, it's highly volatile and highly risky, and cash flow may be great for 4 or 5 years, but then if a competitor like Pfizer or somebody comes out with a competitive drug, once the drug becomes generic or something that's competitive with it, all bets are off for that little company. So usually with the biotech companies, planning a strategic exit as soon as possible is the best way to go, and having a big company buy it out or having a venture capital fund take a large stake of it is the way to go. But it's even then, with venture capital funding, it doesn't mean it's going to be successful. 9 out of every 10 VC investments fail. So, and that's not because they don't know what they're doing, it's just because it's risky. It's highly volatile, highly risky. So we've talked about getting the company to the next level, understanding the levels of the business. And we've talked about how you value a company at any given stage of the business. Any other questions on valuation before I move on? Because we'll get to the next stage, which is how do you keep this thing growing? How do you keep it going? How do you keep it surviving? Well, funding is always a challenge for the startup. Sources of funding is always a challenge. And then keeping your people is the other big challenge. So let's talk about funding first. Two basic ways to raise money. You can lend it to somebody or borrow from somebody to get the money. Debt is basically a concept of I owe you, I have to pay you back over some period of time, almost always with interest, based on some market measurement of what interest is. It might be a prime rate. It might be LIBOR plus a multiple. The earlier stage the company, the higher the interest rate, because the risk associated with the business is that much higher. This is what we call the cost of debt. And debt can be very expensive for companies that don't have collateral or assets to pledge to borrow against. And then there's equity. Equity comes in different shapes and sizes. The basic form of equity is common stock in a corporation, or membership interests in a limited liability company. Common stock can come in different classes and different forms. It can be voting, it could be non-voting. Often we'll set up a non-voting common stock class for those clients that want to incentivize their employees to get equity capital but don't want them to impede the growth of the business by having voting rights. Equity also consists of preferred stock. Preferred stock, you sell it in your practices, has a higher ranking than common stock if you liquidate the business. The preferred shareholders get paid before the common shareholders. And preferred comes in different shapes and sizes. In one venture-backed deal, private equity-backed deal that I worked with, we had 6 series of preferred stock. Series A, B, C, D, E, F, and all of those series had different rights and preferences depending on when the money was put in, at what stage, and how the company was doing. That's a measure of valuation, by the way. That, you can also use that to peg the valuation of a company, the most recent price at which the company is sold equity securities. And this preferred stock often is convertible into common stock, and all of the rights and preferences can be extremely complex. I've drafted these agreements for clients over the years, and after a company goes public, they may actually issue additional stock in different series in private placements to raise additional money to fund the company, because going out to the public may not be feasible or easy to do. There are all kinds of securities law constraints on that. There are all kinds of tax law issues. And then, of course, there's corporate governance issues that come into play when you're dealing with debt and equity. But the sources of funds, the traditional sources of funds, are go to your bank. Oh yeah, okay, go to your bank. In 2008, go to your bank. Where did the bank go? I thought its door was over here. Today it's a little easier, but still not quite as easy. I'll give you a personal example. I sold my house in Great Falls, and I was supposed to close on Monday. And I won't name the bank because somebody here might be affiliated with them or associated with them in some way, but the bank told the buyer on Monday morning that they needed to get verification from a tenant on a rental property in Argentina. And they told them on Monday morning. And we had already signed the documents. We were expecting to close and get our funding on Monday afternoon. And the buyer, who is a general counsel of a very large publicly traded government contractor, who has more, 10 times more wealth than I do in his equity and other assets, couldn't close because the bank had to check the box on this one thing that they forgot to tell him, really should have told him 2 weeks or 3 weeks in advance. We couldn't close. So I'm forcing the bank to pay me extra money for the delay that's been caused by the bank, not by the buyer. Buyer was ready, willing, and able to go to closing, and hopefully we'll close this week. But banks are not easy to deal with. Let me just put it that way. I deal with them every day on putting clients' assets into revocable trusts and trying to help them understand what a trust is. It's amazing the level of incompetence at our banks. Now, unless you know somebody at higher levels, it makes it very difficult. Of course, friends and family are the greatest source of financing startups. You can go to them. Usually you want to give them something that they're willing to give you the money. Usually they want the money back. So structuring it as a debt or convertible debt is preferable to the investor, but structuring it as equity, common equity, is preferable to the owner because there's no obligation to pay it back at any given point in time. Angel investors, they used to be really prevalent in the area until crowdfunding hit. and crowdfunding's become a lot more popular. Crowdfunding is really dangerous until the SEC comes out with more definitive regulations on what the person, the issuer, who's going out to get crowdfunding needs to do. They've recently come out with some regulations, but it's not clear as to what the issuer of the securities needs to do.
So what's the definition of crowdfunding?
It's going out to a site like GoFundMe or whatever, and saying, I am starting up this new company, I have a great idea, who would like to invest in us? Well, some crowdfunding sites say, give me $100 and I'll give you a t-shirt and a stock certificate. Well, a stock certificate is an equity security. So what do you have to do when you're issuing equity securities? You're now subject to the Securities and Exchange Commission laws, federal law as well as state law. And so you need to understand what you're doing if you're doing that. And a lot of my clients say, yeah, but it's so easy. I can go out and I can raise $20,000, $30,000 like that. You can get $30,000 and you can get sued and have a $150,000 legal bill to defend yourself for fraud or whatever it is that you did. So you have to make sure that you're following the disclosure requirements, your clients are following the disclosure requirements.